Welcome to the Digital Dispatch, a podcast series that covers what's going on in technology policy today and what that means for the geopolitics and society of tomorrow.
We just have a new law about data brokers with very specific restrictions on transferring data to foreign adversaries. It is a big deal because it is the first data transfer restriction from the United States in many ways. And so that's a really interesting new world to be living in.
Today, Jim and I will talk about the recent actions that Congress and the White House have taken to prevent foreign adversaries from accessing Americans' personal information, including the February 28th executive order on data security and the new law signed April 24th that aims to prevent data brokers from selling sensitive data to high-risk countries and require TikTok to either divest or leave the United States. Then we turn to a conversation with Coben's Weifel Keegan, managing director of the IAPP's Washington, D.C. office, to take us through developments on commercial privacy legislation and what this means for U.S. businesses. Jim, it seems like preventing China from accessing U.S. personal information has become one of those rare bipartisan issues in D.C. Congress voted overwhelmingly in favor of the data broker and the TikTok measures. The House voted actually 414-0 in favor of the data broker law, if that gives us any indication. But the question that I keep getting over and over, and I think something that hasn't really been well explained to the public, is what are the specific risks that Congress and the White House are trying to address? In other words, what does China specifically gain from accessing Americans' personal data?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. And there's a couple background elements here that are worth thinking about. First, most people or many people now realize the benefits of collecting this kind of data for advertising, for targeted advertising. And so you focus on that word targeted for a minute. Second, China, for its own reasons, remember the Chinese are a little paranoid. They collect personal data on all of their citizens in excruciating detail, and they've started doing that with foreigners, including Americans. And third, there's probably some stuff going on with the intelligence community that we don't know about. So put all that together, and it's reasonable to say, why should we let the Chinese have access to this stuff? Isn't there risk there?
Yeah. And I can imagine how access to sensitive personal information, including a person's location, for example, or communications history or internet browsing history, poses privacy concerns in general, just because that can reveal very sensitive details about our lives. But how would China's access to this information affect the average person in the United States?
Probably not a heck of a lot, because the Chinese, at least at the moment, don't seem to care about the average American. Mm-hmm. If you're doing some sort of influence operation, sure, you'll want to target them for political action. But, you don't necessarily know who you're going to get when you collect this information. And so you might collect on 1,000 people, of whom only 10 will be interesting. And that's probably more what the Chinese are doing. One of the big changes that really happened a few years ago in intelligence is the move to big data analysis. So hoover up data on millions of individuals, run different statistical programs on it, see if you come out with anything interesting. If you can afford it, why not do it? And that's, I think, some of the concern about what the Chinese are up to.
Yeah. And those 10 people, are those more likely to be like political dissidents, for example, or journalists or military service members? Who's most at risk?
Well, it's sort of all of the above. The Chinese are most concerned with political dissidents. That's their biggest fear. They wouldn't mind being able to identify U.S. security officials, right, to the extent they need this data to do that. So I think those are the two things going on. We know the Chinese have become probably since 2015, very intrusive in their efforts to control Chinese living abroad.
Right.
And the personal data is part of that.
Right. And it's also interesting because we hear things a lot like blackmail or espionage as concerns.
Yeah. Snore.
Snore. Well, coming from the White House of what China could potentially do, especially for, like you mentioned, Chinese citizens living abroad in the United States.
That's different.
Yeah.
Blackmailing Chinese citizens is easy for the Chinese. And we just saw some recent examples. Someone said they got a call from their father saying, oh, by the way, the Ministry of State Security has been by and said maybe you should tone it down.
Oh, wow.
Someone living in the United States. So that's blackmailing or coercing Chinese citizens resident in foreign countries is just part of the game plan.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in 2015, as we all know, the Chinese made off with 17 million records of people holding security clearances in the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. And their family members and biometric data and all sorts of stuff. There hasn't been a single case of blackmail as a result. Maybe it's the Chinese are lazy or maybe it's on their to-do list. But if it's been 9 years and nothing's happened, how much risk is there really? It doesn't mean you want the Chinese doing it. I mean the fact that there is taking this information. That was a huge intelligence coup for them because they basically got all civilian agencies with a few exceptions. So they now have a list of everyone who was in 2015 connected to the intelligence community, but they have not used it for blackmail.
I can definitely see how that type of intimidation is maybe a really serious concern for a small percentage of the population. Like you mentioned, those 10 out of 100 people or Chinese citizens living abroad. But I would say for the majority of the population, so most U.S. citizens who have no connection to China whatsoever, like China's access to data poses really real privacy risks. But these risks aren't necessarily limited to China. We're also seeing these privacy risks come from U.S. companies or even law enforcement agencies that have more of a direct impact on our lives.
That's one of the complexities of this issue. There's things that are objectionable about TikTok because of its Chinese ownership.
Yeah.
There's things that are objectionable to TikTok that are objectionable for all social media. And we haven't done a good job separating out the two, in part because it's a lot easier to be mean to China than it is to be mean to Twitter or Facebook. Twitter, that might change, but, that's the deal.
Yeah. And then there are the national security concerns, but then there's also the talk about economic and technological competition. Like even with TikTok, I hear critics say China has already banned so many U.S. companies. Why shouldn't the United States ban China? Or even concerns that allowing China to access all of this personal information from Americans could help it train artificial intelligence. So what are your thoughts on that?
The Chinese believe there's a competition. And so if you look at what Xi Jinping on down says, they think that being perceived as the leader in innovation in technology is crucial for being the leader in the world. So they're on board with that. Reciprocity is a word that Chinese really don't like. And so when you say, hey, we're just doing to you what you did to us, they don't really have a good answer. The effect of all this is a bit more difficult to trace out because this is America, so there's always a degree of panic and hysteria. People used to say, well, the Chinese have 1 billion citizens and that gives them an advantage in AI. Turns out that wasn't true, right? So we tend to be a little more fearful about China than it really deserves. Not to say they aren't good competitors. They have great engineers. They're very determined and they're a dictatorship. Other than that, though, we're still ahead.
Finding the goals of these data broker and TikTok measures is only half of the equation. And I think the other half is really asking whether these proposed solutions would really be effective in addressing them. So if our goal is to prevent China from accessing sensitive personal information, does this new executive order on data security or does the new TikTok law or the data broker law really address that?
There's a lot of ways around it, and it'll take time to figure out what they are. But, I think a number of us hearing the new rules announced immediately thought of ways to circumvent them. But that doesn't mean we should not put the rule in place. It just means we probably need to think of what additional efforts we need to take. So if the terms of competition haven't been clearly defined, and when you think about export controls or access to data, we haven't defined them clearly enough to take effective measures. It'll take a while to work that out, but think of this as the first tranche, starting probably with the Trump administration and continue on into Biden, the first tranche of measures to disconnect from China. And it's probably a good idea. It's just going to be hard to do.
Yeah, and even the White House, when issuing the executive order, stated this is a very narrow solution. It's not meant to solve everything. But then what might be necessary to improve the efficacy of these measures?
Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but the internet's kind of a cesspool.
Yeah.
And that wasn't what we expected when it was commercialized. At this point, God, like 28 years ago, right? And so it was supposed to be peace and harmony and, didn't work out. And so it's difficult because it falls in the space of what appears to be protected by the First Amendment, by freedom of speech. And true in all countries that have honest protections for freedom of speech. My question is always, is threatening someone with violence protected by freedom of speech? The answer is no, but a lot of people in the more populist elements of the population come up to that line on a daily basis. So we're going to have to wrestle with this question of the new technology creates unlimited access to information, unlimited ability to communicate, but it's used in ways that are very damaging for our society. And, I guess the short answer is if you have to pick between freedom of speech and Parler or something like that, go with freedom of speech. But we've got to find some better answer than that.
Yeah, it's really hard because the actions that we're taking today could potentially set precedents in the long term, even potentially precedents that we haven't anticipated. I'm still not sure whether this action of banning TikTok is going to have longer term effects on how other countries respond, for example, or if it'll make it easier to ban future communications apps.
Well, one thing to bear in mind is we're not the first to ban TikTok. The biggest country to ban it was India.
That's
and
right.
There's been a lot of banning, a lot of these sort of measures. And what you don't see is the ever-present claim that we're going to see splinternet or a fracturing of the internet. There's too much money for people to fracture the internet. They may put limitations on content. We're still going to have one internet. It's just that there'll be some areas of content that won't be as easy to address. So I don't worry about splinternet. I do worry about getting this robust public dialogue under control.
Right. Do you think, though, that these actions signal a shift away from the traditional U.S. approach to data flows?
That's a good question, and we don't really know the answer because everyone knows there was the USTR sudden movement to withdraw some long-held U.S. positions on digital trade, sort of inexplicable, or at least not well explained by USTR. So we're clearly going through a rethink, and you've got what I'd call the more progressive elements that think we need to crack down on tech giants. You've got the conservative elements that feel that the tech giants are mean to them, probably deservedly so, but they still think they're mean. And you've got everyone else in the middle. So it's a hard problem to sort out, but we're going to need to find some way to reestablish some degree of social order on the internet. And that will be difficult to do in a way that doesn't compromise other important rights.
Yeah, definitely. I am hearing those words a lot. Big tech regulation, export controls. Those are just huge topics in Washington, D.C. right now. And I'm sure that'll give us plenty to talk about in the coming months. But I also think that's a good transition into our next conversation with Coben's Weifel Keegan on domestic policy updates in Congress, especially since many would argue that we can't prevent U.S. companies from transferring sensitive information to foreign adversaries without addressing how those companies are allowed to collect all of this personal information in the first place. Next on the podcast, we're joined by Coben's Weifel Keegan, the managing director of the DC office of the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Prior to his current role, Coben also served as Deputy Director of Privacy Initiatives at BBB National Programs and a Weston Research Fellow at the IAPP. Coben, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Caitlin. It's great to be here.
There have been a lot of privacy action so far in 2024. Some might even say a surprising amount of privacy actions. So what do you make of all this? Why are we seeing so much momentum on privacy and security now?
Well, from my perspective, privacy never really goes away. It never sleeps. And I guess we do go through periods of ebb and flow of policymaking activity, that's for sure. But I think sometimes it takes administration kind of the whole period to get to the point of making big actions, especially some of these big foreign affairs level actions on privacy issues. And so since we're nearing the end of the administration, I think that's part of why we're seeing enhanced activity. And the same thing in Congress, probably would have seen more activity sooner if there was more cohesion in the ability to come together on things. But we're seeing that there is a possibility of bipartisanship still as we're nearing the end of this term as well, potentially anyway.
Yeah. And speaking of big action, what is the status of discussions around privacy legislation on the Hill?
We have plenty to unpack in that question. There has been, throughout the term, there's been a lot of engagement on kids' privacy issues in particular. So that part is not surprising. And there's a whole flurry of bills that are still out there from both the Judiciary Committee and the Commerce Committee in the Senate, focused on kids' safety, on kids' privacy, and kind of all of the overlapping issues there. And now a new bill this week that's meant to get kids off of social media, right? But most importantly, from the privacy side, we saw that big new comprehensive discussion draft released a few weeks ago now, the American Privacy Rights Act, the APRA, or APRA. We're still trying to decide. I guess people are saying APRA, so I guess
people saying APRA?
I keep hearing people say APRA. I think I like APRA, so maybe I'll just, if you don't like it, I'll say APRA. I think I like that better anyway, because I say ADPPA. We didn't used to say ADPA. Some people did. I don't know. This is always the perennial policy wonk debate, is whether to pronounce an acronym or spell it out. But anyway, whatever you call it, it is a big comprehensive framework. And by comprehensive, I mostly mean that it's not sectoral, that it covers all different types of companies, and that and this actually would apply to nonprofits, not just the commercial sector. It borrows a lot from the prior proposal, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, the ADPPA, but it also borrows significantly from Senator Cantwell's earlier proposal, COPRA, the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act. It is kind of a merger of those two bills, if you look at it closely, and that makes sense because the people that put it forward are Senator Cantwell and Representative Cathy McMorris Rodgers, who lead their respective committees in the Senate and the House. And those two bills were their respective bills that have been kind of merged to make this. And there's also some new innovative ideas in there as well, which is pretty interesting and has caused a new flurry of activity in DC around privacy issues.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about those new innovative ideas. Like, how is this discussion draft, or is this discussion draft different from previous attempts, whether in terms of substance or potential to pass?
I'll start with the substance. Yeah. It is different. There's a lot. It shares a lot of DNA. I like Keir Lamont at the Future Privacy Forum has a great way of putting it, which is that humans also share a lot of DNA with a banana, but we end up being, even with 90% the same, we end up being very different on the outside. And I think that's also true of these kinds of bills. Even though there's a lot of similarities, even small differences can manifest in big ways. So I think it's easiest to point some of the obvious changes. So, and one of them is that in the AI part of the bill, they've added an opt-out provision from algorithmic decision making, which is, I think, meant to keep pace with state developments. Since these prior bills were circulated, a lot of states have added algorithmic decision making provisions to their privacy bills and now laws. And so I think that's kind of meant to recognize that a modern framework should have some sort of provision around that type of thing. This also has a different compromise, a different balance when it comes to the most contested parts of privacy conversations around these types of frameworks, which include the private right of action and preemption. One of Senator Cantwell's ongoing concerns with ADPPA was the fact that it failed to prevent companies from contracting around the private right of action, from including arbitration provisions that would put you outside of courts and into the arbitration world. This creates a restriction on when you can do that, and it limits the power of arbitration agreements. It also is it is otherwise, it's a slightly different balance on the private right of action. And the same thing with preemption. It's preserving some sectoral laws in the states and the state's ability to create new laws around certain areas of privacy, but is overall meant to preempt most of the now 14, 15, 16, depending on the day, state laws that have been enacted that look a lot like this.
Yeah, I want to get back to preemption, especially with all of the actions that we're seeing in the states. But I wanted to just quickly say, on a very high level, I do think that the discussion draft demonstrates the amount of progress that has been made over the past few years, so the past few legislative sessions. Like, I remember a time when Congress was debating, like, should we have opt-in or opt-out provisions, or should civil rights belong in a privacy bill? But now we are seeing that data minimization is a part of this discussion draft. We are seeing bipartisan consensus on algorithms or algorithmic bias. So I do think that at least from that very high level, there has been a lot of progress made over the past few years.
Yeah, and I think states have had an impact there, right? Like, I think part of the reason we've seen so much activity in the states is because of federal inaction, and that activity has caused the conversation to change to some extent. And also the hard work of prior negotiators, like the diverse group of people that were involved in negotiating ADPPA, has continued to pay dividends here, where you see the bias civil rights provisions being retained, even though those same people weren't involved in negotiating this. And that's still on the table, and still very much seeming like it will be expected to be part of any future framework like this. But we didn't talk about whether it will pass. I know you asked that as part of your initial question. I think it's very difficult to have lots of optimism about anything in this Congress. But there is certainly a path to passage, and I think there's a lot of will to get it done. Some of that comes from CMR, Cathy McMorris-Rodgers, who is retiring, stepping down at the end of this term. And so I think she does you could certainly tell a narrative that she wants to have a legacy, knowing that she's put so much effort into passing a law like this throughout her tenure. It would be nice to put a bow on it and finish that. And I think that's creating some of the momentum that we're seeing here.
Right.
And I think after this term, it will be hard to say who will be picking up the mantle on the Republican side in the House to be pushing for a bill like this. So that is one piece of pressure that is adding to the possibility of passage. The Senate is just a harder question, I think, especially. I think it'll come down more to individual senators and how whether this resonates with them.
Right. Yeah. There's definitely the will. At least there's bipartisan consensus on the need for privacy legislation, even if Congress hasn't passed privacy law yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's another way that the conversation has changed since the states started enacting bills, is everyone supports some sort of comprehensive privacy bill. It just depends on if everyone agrees that we've gotten the balance right here. And I think, I mean, the other big piece that is difficult is just time. There's not enough time in the calendar to pass a lot of things before the end of the term. It'll have to be a priority for it to make it into law.
Which is always the hardest thing, right? Because there's just so much on the plate right now in Congress, and this happens every year. There's just so much that structural change is not always the easiest thing. But speaking of the states, we talked about how innovation in the states when it comes to privacy laws has raised the bar for Congress to enact stronger legislation at a federal level. And we have seen that more and more state legislators are introducing and passing new legislation. Do you think that this dynamic can or should affect the urgency or the stakes for a federal bill?
Yeah, it's been a landslide in terms of the swiftness with which that's moved. I mean, 2 years ago, it was still 3 or 5. It went 3, 5,
right,
10, and now, like this term already, we've seen all sorts, a huge number of states added, including a lot more innovations. I think there's a lot of the states really share a common skeleton. I mean, I guess we can keep the DNA analogy. They're almost entirely the same. They were like fraternal twins, maybe. Yeah. But some of these newer states are starting to experiment a little bit more. And so we're seeing places like Maryland where there is a data minimization standard at play, which will kind of turn the usual framing on its head, much like APRA does. It'll be interesting to see if that adds pressure and momentum for federal passage. I think that has always been the theory, that if people are concerned about a patchwork, that it's only when there really is a divergence, a patchwork that has real differences to add to compliance burdens, that will become a major problem for companies.
So what are you hearing from companies? How are companies complying with these new state laws while also preparing for the possibility of a federal law, or are they?
I think they generally are. Most of the companies, at least the companies that I hear from, who I know have privacy people and therefore are kind of taking privacy seriously, they often are creating a single standard, like you're building one compliance program that's meant to meet the minimum requirements of all of the states. That does become more complex, especially if states diverge or possibly even conflict. That's still not too common, that there's like actual conflicts of laws, but there is also this sort of privacy exists on a global stage as well. And there's comprehensive frameworks all over the world now. The US is a major outlier when it comes to having that at a federal level from compared to all the other developed economies basically in the world. And companies, do a lot of work to try to create a cohesive framework that meets all of those standards. And they do, I think, part of my role and part of policy people's roles generally is to inform where things might be going. And I think that does have an impact on operations, but it's not the same as when there's a real law to hang your hat on, as they say.
Right. We talked about all of at least some of the developments in the United States, but I'm sure if we also talked about everything going on outside the United States,
we could have more than a short podcast for sure.
Exactly. Several podcast episodes. So Cathy McMorris Rodgers has suggested that the draft American Privacy Rights Act is stronger than any state law on the books. And do you agree with this statement? What are your thoughts?
That's a good question. I think it's always really difficult to compare one-to-one the strength, the overall strength. I think it can be a loaded question. I think what she means there is that on the whole, she believes her framework is stronger than any other state.
Yeah.
I think if you look provision by provision, it's easy to find areas where a state may have a stronger particular protection versus APRA and vice versa. And I think that becomes particularly hard. It's harder to do once you have states like California and Colorado that have regulations on top of their laws that are potentially interpreting their laws in a certain way and adding additional rigor to what was originally black letter law. And some of those regulations remain to be tested. So it's hard to say what at the end of the day will be the final call as to exactly what the law is in each of those states and how companies are complying with it. But regardless, it is a very strong, it's a strong framework, and it does learn from the states and attempts. It seems to be reflecting a lot of the same standards that are across the states that have adopted these types of frameworks. So you'd be hard pressed to say that it's a very weak bill, which I think is partially why we see pushback and a lot of stakeholder engagement right now as people are digesting and thinking about what they would change in this framework.
Right. And I guess we'll see if it addresses the concerns from some in Congress about preempting stronger state laws that we saw from past sessions.
Yeah. And I think, there already are differences of opinion of how the preemption would work in practice. I kind of want to dig into that some more myself to figure out what I think it says.
Yeah.
But it is clearly trying to strike a balance where there are particular things like employment data, employment protections that are exempted. They're not covered by APRA, and they're also exempted as being allowed for states to continue to enforce, which makes me believe that California's employment privacy protections, which are the only ones in the country, are potentially safe and able to be enforced by the California agency. But others have read that and disagreed with that analysis. So I think that's always part of the challenge, is preemption also ends up coming down to court interpretations and provision by provision analysis. And it starts to be pretty messy. But this is trying to strike a balance. And it's just a question of whether it's the balance that makes enough people happy that it can be a cohesive final product.
And you're right. And it won't touch some other categories like consumer protection or state civil rights laws, for example.
Right, exactly. It keeps all of those existing major areas intact. And also, like, education, privacy. So a lot of the places where you've seen a lot of oversight already are kept intact there. And I mean, I think the drafters would also say that this also empowers state enforcers to enforce this law. So it's, even if it has slight differences, or even if parts of it might be weaker overall, it's continuing to empower the same state enforcers that are empowered under their existing codes, and also making it a uniform standard across the country so that all 50 AGs can bring enforcement actions.
Right. I just have one more question for you. And I know that we already talked about the possibility of federal privacy legislation passing, which is really the big question that everybody asks. What do you think is realistic for Congress to achieve in this session?
Well, we've already got we just have a new law about data brokers with the very specific restrictions on transferring data to foreign adversaries. Mm-hmm. So that was somewhat surprising and impressive that we saw some sort of privacy law pass, even if it's relatively targeted. It is a big deal because it is the first data transfer restriction from the United States in many ways. And so that's a really interesting new world to be living in. Yes, I think I'm more bullish on kids' privacy than on the comprehensive framework, although there's a lot of attempt to tie them together, right? The Senate has worked very hard, as I mentioned, on kids' protections. And so there's a lot of support for KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, and COPPA 2.0, as well as some of those other Judiciary Committee kids safety protections bills that are floating around out there. So I wouldn't be surprised if some kids legislation passes of some kind, and the question is whether that can be tied with this or not. But there, as I mentioned before, I think there's dwindling time, and there's dwindling floor time. There's a lot of priorities that Senate leadership wants to accomplish. The House is maybe going to have a leadership issue yet again. So like the amount of time that is spent on the floor passing substantive law is still dwindling in both chambers. And so I think that really is the number one challenge. The clock is the number one challenge. But there's a lot of support for these types of frameworks, and Leader Schumer on the Senate side really wants to do things about AI and kids protections and maybe privacy. He doesn't mention privacy very much, but all of that kind of makes it a strong maybe that something will happen before the end of the year.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll have to have this conversation again in a few months. Yeah, exactly. to debrief anything that happens. Well, thank you so much again, Kovin, for joining us and just for unpacking everything that has happened so far this year when it comes to privacy. This has just been really informative and really interesting.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me here. I'm always happy to talk about all of the privacy things, especially when big new things happen here in DC. So this has been really delightful to chat with you.
All of the privacy things and all of the acronyms.
Exactly. I try to spell them out every time. I have to keep that little file in my brain always.